The laughter in the Elkhorn Creek diner rolled over him like a slow wave of gasoline, warm and ugly, the kind that catches fire without warning. A man at the counter pointed at Jax Harlan's chapped hands and said the word veteran like it meant something broken. 12 years, 3 deployments, a wife who sold the house while he was in the hospital, a family that stopped writing after the second Christmas. Smoky lay still at his boots, amber eyes tracking every laugh. They called him the crazy man with the old windmill. In 3 months, this valley will lose its power for 90 days, and he will be the only man left standing. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The cold in the Miller Creek rest stop parking lot had a specific texture at 4 in the morning, a kind of cold that was not simply temperature, but rather a patient presence that pressed itself against the glass of Jax Harlan's 2003 Ford pickup with the slow, curious weight of something living. Frost had bloomed across the inside of the windshield in long, feathered ferns that caught the orange glow of the single working sodium lamp above the dumpster and scattered it into a dim, amber constellation. The diesel hum of an idling semi somewhere at the far end of the lot was the only sound in the world, and even that sound felt reduced, muffled, as though the Montana snow that had fallen all night had absorbed everything larger than a whisper. Jax lay on his back beneath 2 wool surplus blankets and 1 canvas tarp, his breath rising above his face in slow pale clouds that dissolved against the roofliner. He had not yet opened his eyes. He did not need to. 41 years of a body had taught him exactly where the cold was at any given moment, which toe had gone numb first, which shoulder was closest to the cab frame, which elbow had cramped against the worn steering column in his sleep. His body kept its own inventory. His body had been doing that for a very long time. At his right side, pressed along the length of his ribs with the kind of controlled stillness that only a working dog ever fully learns, Smoky breathed in the steady, even rhythm of an animal who was not asleep and would not be asleep until she was certain he was safe. Her thick double coat radiated a warmth that had saved his life in winters he no longer liked to count. Her amber eyes, when he finally opened his own, were already open. Already watching the shadow of the dumpster through the frost on the driver's window, already measuring the space around the truck for any shape that did not belong. He lifted his scarred right hand and rested it flat against the heavy, warm fur along her shoulder. She did not move. She simply pressed a fraction harder against his ribs in acknowledgement, and the small rhythmic thump of her heavy tail against the canvas tarp sounded exactly once, the way it always did. A soldier's salute rendered in wordless weight. "Morning," he said. The word left his chapped mouth like a small stone pushed through ice. He sat up slowly, with the careful deliberation of a man whose back had been rebuilt twice, and the blankets slid from his shoulders and pooled in his lap. He wore a thermal undershirt beneath a surplus wool sweater beneath a canvas field jacket that had been olive drab in another life and was now the color of old dust and gun oil. The cuffs of the jacket had frayed into soft strings along the inside of each wrist. He did not notice them anymore. A man only notices the fraying of his clothes when he still has a home to return to and a mirror in which to examine himself. Jax had neither. He pulled his combat boots out from under the passenger seat and worked his feet into them with the methodical patience of a man who understood that doing things quickly was a young man's luxury. Laces tight, double knot, one hand smoothed over the top of each boot to check for moisture, for salt, for any small flaw that might become a problem later. The checking was not conscious. The checking was simply what his hands did now, what they had always done, what they would do long after his mind had forgotten why. The small gas canister of his Jetboil sat wedged between the passenger seat and the center console, and he lit it with the single-click spark of a man who had lit 10,000 field stoves in places whose names no American newspaper had ever printed. The blue flame hissed to life. He filled the titanium cup with water from a plastic gallon jug that had begun to form a thin lens of ice along the inside of its neck. He waited. He watched Smoky watch the lot. Nothing moved. Nothing ever moved at this hour except the long, slow sighs of idling trucks and the occasional pair of headlights drifting down the highway shoulder toward some destination that had nothing to do with him. When the water boiled, he stirred in a half-packet of instant coffee and a second half-packet of the same. He drank it black, and he drank it slowly. The warmth spread down through his chest and into his belly, and for the small space of that warmth, he was not a 41-year-old combat veteran sleeping in a pickup truck in a Montana parking lot. For the small space of that warmth, he was simply a man drinking coffee, as the sky began to gray at its eastern seam. Smoky lifted her head, sniffed once at the air that leaked through the cracked window sill, and laid her heavy muzzle back down across his thigh. Her amber eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds, which was her way of telling him that the perimeter was calm, that he could drink his coffee without strategic attention. He had learned to read her rhythms the way other men read the weather. From the inside breast pocket of his field jacket, he pulled a folded square of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn through the ink in 2 places. He did not open it. He simply held it in his lap, with his palm pressed flat across it, the way a man holds a photograph of a person he is no longer allowed to call by name. The paper was a copy of the divorce decree. He had not read it in 14 months. He carried it the way a man carries a piece of shrapnel the surgeons could not reach. Not because it hurt him less to have it there, but because pretending it was gone would hurt him more. Her name had been Melanie. They had been married for 9 years. She had signed the paperwork to sell the house in Fort Benning while he was still in the VA hospital in Tacoma, recovering from the second surgery on his lower back. She had not told him. He had come home on a Greyhound bus to an empty driveway and a realtor's sign planted in the grass where his daughter had once run through a sprinkler on a summer afternoon that he had photographed and still kept somewhere, though he could no longer remember exactly which box the photograph was in or whether he still owned the box. The daughter was not his by blood. She had been 4 when he married Melanie. She had called him Dad in a voice that had not yet learned to be careful. She was 13 now. She had not written in 16 months. His father, a retired foreman from a steel plant in Pennsylvania that had closed in 1998, had told him on the phone one evening that Melanie had called and explained everything, that she had her reasons, that a man who disappeared for a year at a time could not expect a woman to wait forever. His father's voice had been very calm when he said this. His father had not said his name. His father had not said son. His father had said, "We think it is better if you find your own way for a while." And then his father had said, "I love you," and then his father had hung up. That had been 11 months ago. Jax had not called him back. The not calling had become its own weight heavier each month, and now he did not know how to lift it. He refolded the paper along its old creases and slid it back into the breast pocket. Smoky's ear flicked once against his knee. He scratched the soft place behind her ear without looking at her. This was their language. It worked. Outside, the sky had begun to pale from black to the bruised color of a flat tin roof, and the first long pink seam of sunrise was climbing up the shoulders of the eastern ridge. Elkhorn Valley lay below the rest stop in a wide spoon of snow-covered ranchland, dotted with small clusters of lights where the scattered homesteads were waking up to the new cold. A single column of wood smoke rose from somewhere west of the interstate. Very thin, very straight, the smoke of a stove that someone had banked carefully overnight and was now feeding back to life. Jax watched the smoke for a long time. It was the kind of detail that a certain part of him had never stopped cataloging. A detail that in another life had told him whether a village was hostile or friendly, whether a family was home, whether the day was about to become something it had not been a moment before. The habits did not leave. The habits were not going to leave. He turned the truck key 1 click forward and let the heater blow cold air for 30 seconds before the coil warmed enough to push anything resembling warmth into the cab. The fuel gauge sat just under a quarter tank. He did the math in his head the way a man does math when math is the last instrument of dignity he has left. $314 in the envelope under the floor mat, $241 in a savings account that Melanie had somehow not drained. A VA disability check coming in 12 days. He could eat. He could not eat well. Smoky ate better than he did. That had been the rule since the day they had been discharged, and he had not broken it yet. He ate a single protein bar from the inside pocket of his pack and gave Smoky a full cup of kibble in the blue plastic bowl that fit exactly into the well of the passenger floorboard. She ate the way she did everything else, with discipline, without hurry, her amber eyes lifting once to check on him between bites. When she was finished, She licked the bowl clean twice, sat back on her haunches, and waited. "All right, girl," he said. "Let's see what today wants." He opened the driver's door and the cold hit him. The way cold hits a man who has been cold long enough that his body has stopped complaining about it. The snow in the lot was unbroken where no trucks had parked, and the crust over it made a small, brittle, crackling sound under his boots as he walked Smoky along the tree line at the edge of the lot. She did her business with the brisk efficiency of an animal who understood that lingering was a waste of daylight. She returned to his side and sat, and together they watched the sunrise climb above the ridgeline and paint the whole snow-covered valley in a pale, rose-gold light that, for a single long instant, made the world look almost forgivable. That was when he heard the truck. It came up the rest-stop drive in the slow, deliberate crawl of a vehicle whose driver was not in a hurry and was probably not planning to buy gas. A faded blue 1987 Chevy Silverado with a cracked rear window and a small American flag decal peeling from the lower corner of the passenger side. The truck pulled in 3 spaces down from his Ford, idled for a moment, and shut off. The door opened. An old woman climbed down onto the packed snow with the careful two-handed grip of a person whose knees had been arguing with her about mornings for a number of years. She was tall for her age, perhaps 5'8", dressed in a heavy Carhartt coat the color of old straw, a wool scarf the color of dried blood, leather work gloves, and a pair of insulated boots that had clearly done this winter and a great many winters before it. Her hair was the flat silver of a frozen pond. Her face was all lines, and the lines were not the kind that came from complaining. She walked toward him without hesitation and without any of the wariness that people usually carried when they approached a stranger at a rest stop in the dark. She stopped at a courteous distance, 10 feet, and she looked at him directly, and she looked at Smoky directly, and she did not look away. "You're the fellow who slept here the last 3 nights, she said. It was not a question. Jax said nothing. He had learned that silence was not rudeness, only economy. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said. "I own a piece of land about 4 miles west of here, off the old Miller Road. There's a windmill on it that was built in 1958 and hasn't turned right since 1987. I need a man who's good with his hands and who doesn't mind work that won't pay much. Room and board and $100 a week for as long as it takes. The dog eats at my table." The wind turned once over the snow. Somewhere in the tree line a raven called. Smoky's ears rotated forward a quarter of an inch and then settled. She had read Eleanor Hayes in 3 seconds, and her verdict was printed in the stillness of her posture. Jax looked at the old woman for a long moment. He looked at the faded American flag decal on her truck. He looked at the way she stood on the snow with her weight distributed evenly across both boots, the way a person stands who has lived through more winters than she had planned to and had stopped counting them a while ago. "Why me?" he said finally. Eleanor Hayes smiled, very small, very tired, very honest. "Because you're still here," she said. "And because my husband was a Marine, and I know what one looks like, even when he's trying not to be seen." The road to the Hayes farmstead ran west off the interstate along a County 2 lane that had been last repaved sometime during the first Bush administration, and the frost heaves along its edges had opened into small, dark chasms that the county road crew had not been back to address. Jax drove slowly behind Eleanor's blue Silverado, his own tires riding the crown of the road where the asphalt was most honest. Smoky sitting upright in the passenger seat with her amber eyes tracking the fence lines and the occasional plume of wood smoke rising from a homestead chimney on the low rolling hills to the south. The morning light was full gold now, angled and long, and it laid itself across the snow in such a way that every single rut and hoofprint in the fields looked freshly carved. 4 miles west, Eleanor's brake lights blinked on and she turned right through a wooden gate that hung slightly crooked from its hinges, the wood of it silver with age and the old paint weathered down to the grain. A hand-painted sign nailed to the right-hand post read Hayes, and beneath that, in smaller and fainter letters that had been added at a later date, just Hayes. Jax did not understand the second line. He stored it for later. The driveway curved between two rows of ancient cottonwoods whose bare branches laced together overhead like the black ribs of a cathedral, and at the end of the drive, set against the low blue shoulder of a foothill, the old farmstead came into view. A two-story clapboard house painted a faded white that had gone the color of winter milk. A long, sagging covered porch along its south face. A red barn with the paint half gone, and the metal roof showing patches of rust like dried rose petals. A chicken coop that had clearly not housed chickens in a long time. A root cellar with a stone foundation and a door braced with fresh pine, and beyond all of it, rising from a small rise in the pasture behind the house, the windmill. It was not one of the ornamental tin windmills that sat decoratively on hobby farms for tourists to photograph. It was a working mill, a true one, 38 feet tall from base to top of tail vane, built on a welded steel lattice tower that had been set into a concrete pad in 1958 and had not moved a quarter-inch since. The blade assembly was the classic 18-blade air motor design, the kind built to catch wind at low speeds and translate it into slow, patient rotational force. Half the blades were missing. The tail vane hung at a slight bent angle, a bullet-wound sort of bend. The central gearbox head was wrapped in an old tarp that had itself begun to shred in the wind. But the lattice tower stood perfectly straight. Whoever had set the foundation had set it to last 100 years. Jax shut off his engine. He stepped out. Smoky followed at his left heel without being told. Eleanor walked up alongside him, her gloves shoved deep into her coat pockets, her breath rising in slow clouds against the cold morning air. For a long moment neither of them spoke. They simply stood in the unbroken snow and looked up at the broken windmill, and the wind that came across the pasture made the loose tin on the tail vane rattle once. A small and lonely sound, the sound of a thing that had been waiting a very long time for someone to notice it. Daniel built it in 1958, Eleanor said. He was 24 years old. He pumped water from the back aquifer up through that mill for 30 years. The well went dry in 87. He tried to convert it. He had plans. He didn't finish. Why didn't he finish? Jax said. He died, Eleanor said. The wind turned. The tail vane rattled again. I'm sorry, Jax said. Don't be, Eleanor said. It was 38 years ago. A person learns to carry a thing that long, or they don't. I carried it. She turned and walked toward the barn. Jax and Smoky followed. Inside the barn, the cold had a different quality than the cold outside. Inside the barn, the cold was older, packed into the old hayloft timbers and the concrete floor and the heavy iron harness rings set into the beams above the empty stalls, a cold that had been there since November and was not planning to leave until May. The light came in through the small square windows in long angled bars that caught every drifting mote of dust and hay chaff. It smelled of old diesel and cold leather and the ghost of 40 years of working horses. Eleanor walked to a workbench at the south wall and pulled out a battered leather 3-ring binder that had been wrapped in a canvas shop apron and placed inside a wooden crate on the lower shelf. She carried it to the tailgate of an ancient blue 1968 Ford F-100 that had been parked in the center aisle and covered with a tarp for what looked like 2 decades. She set the binder on the tailgate and opened it. The pages inside were yellow at the edges and soft in the corners where the paper had been handled many times. The handwriting was precise, architectural, drawn with a draftsman's straight ruler and a mechanical pencil that had been sharpened to a needle. Blueprint linework, gear ratios, bearing specifications, hand-labeled torque calculations, sketches of a central burr stone, diagrams of a step-up gear train that would translate the slow, low RPM rotation of an 18-blade air motor head into the faster rotation required to turn a pair of granite millstones for grinding wheat. The mill design was not a decoration. The mill design was a working 19th-century grist mill powered by a 20th-century American farm windmill. Jax stood over the open binder, and he did not speak for a long time. Eleanor watched him. She did not interrupt. She had opened this binder in front of exactly 4 other men over the last 38 years. And all four of them had squinted at it for a moment and then made the small apologetic laugh that a person makes when they are about to tell an old woman that her husband's dream is too complicated for them. She did not expect this man to be the fifth. She did not know yet that he would not be. She was simply waiting. Jax turned a page. He turned another. He ran one scarred index finger along the pencil line of a reduction gear sketched in three-quarter perspective. He looked at the bearing callouts. He looked at the bill of materials that had been taped to the inside of the back cover, a list written in the same precise hand, with prices from 1984 crossed out, and prices from 1986 written above them, and prices from 1987 written above those. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the last drawing, the simple block printing of a man who had been taught to sign his name in a way that could not be misread. D. Hayes. "Your husband was an engineer," Jax said. "My husband was a Marine who became a machinist at the Butte rail yard," Eleanor said. "He taught himself the rest of it out of library books and the GI Bill. He spent every winter from 1978 to 1987 drawing this mill. He said someday the power would go out in this valley and we would need a way to feed people." "That's a specific kind of thing to say," Jax said. "He was a specific kind of man," Eleanor said. Jax closed the binder very carefully, the way a man closes a door on a room that holds something sacred. He laid his palm flat on the leather cover for a long moment. Smoky, beside him, shifted her weight and leaned the thick warmth of her shoulder against his calf. Her amber eyes were steady on Eleanor Hayes, and something in them had settled in the way a rifle settles into the shoulder of a soldier who has decided to take the shot. "I can probably get the mill turning again in 6 weeks," Jax said. "The gearhead is going to take longer. The bearings are likely seized. I'll need to source new blades. I'll need a set of burr stones. I'll need parts your husband priced in 1984, and I will have to find modern equivalents. I am not going to promise you I can finish what he started. I am going to promise you I will try." Eleanor Hayes's face did not change very much. Her eyes glistened once and then did not. She nodded. Once. The small nod of a woman who had learned decades ago to contain large feelings inside small gestures. "There is a room upstairs on the north side of the house," she said. "The bed is old, but the mattress is good. The wood stove in the kitchen heats the whole upstairs if you bank it right. The dog sleeps wherever she wants. I do not care. I do not care at all." "Thank you," Jax said. "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor said. "There are people in this valley who will not be pleased about you being here. One of them is named Barrett Colson. He has been trying to get me to sell this farm to him for 6 years. He has tried every way a man can try that is short of burning me out. You will meet him before the week is out. I am telling you now, so you are not surprised." Jax looked at her steadily. Smoky's ears tilted forward once at the name. "I don't surprise easy," Jax said. "I didn't think you did," Eleanor said. They walked back out of the barn into the pale gold light of the morning. The broken windmill turned a slow quarter rotation in the wind and stopped. The loose tin on the tail vane rattled once. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a raven called again, the same raven from the rest stop or a different one, and the sound carried clean and sharp across the unbroken snow. Jax went to his truck. He took down the canvas duffel from behind the driver's seat. He took down the green rucksack from the passenger floor. He did not own very much more than this. He had not owned very much more than this in 14 months. He carried both bags up to the farmhouse porch, and Smoky walked at his left heel the entire way. And when they reached the bottom step, she stopped and looked up at him. And for the first time in a long time, the amber eyes held something that was not only vigilance. They held something that was almost, not quite, but almost hope. "I know. Girl," he said quietly. "I see it too. Let's just keep our head down." Eleanor held the front door open for them. The warmth of the wood stove inside reached out onto the porch in a soft, invisible hand. The house smelled of cinnamon and coffee and old pine resin and clean laundry folded a long time ago. Jax stepped across the threshold. Smoky followed. The door closed behind them with a solid, heavy sound that the frame had not made, as Eleanor Hayes would tell him later that evening, since the winter of 1987. 3 days later, Jax drove into the town of Elkhorn Creek for the first time since he had become something other than a man passing through. He drove the old blue Silverado because Eleanor had asked him to, and he drove it because the list of things he needed from Henderson's feed and hardware was long enough that his own truck bed would not carry all of it in one trip. Smoky sat on the bench seat beside him, her haunches on the cracked vinyl, her thick coat warm against his right arm, her amber eyes reading every passing fence line. Elkhorn Creek was a town of 943 people, built in a bowl of ranch land where Miller Creek met the Elkhorn River, anchored by a single main street that ran 4 blocks long and contained, in their exact historic order, the post office, the sheriff's substation, the Baptist church, the Catholic church, the Elkhorn Creek Public School, the diner, the feed store, the gas station, the hardware store that had been absorbed into the feed store in 2009, the American Legion Hall, and the small cinder block funeral home that had served the county since before anyone currently driving through it had been born. The valley grid ran off a single aging substation on the east edge of town, fed by a spur line from the main transmission corridor, 42 miles to the south. Jax noticed this the way he noticed everything. The habit did not leave. The habit was not going to leave. He parked in front of Henderson's feed and hardware. He told Smoky to hold. She watched him climb out with the patient stillness of an animal who understood that this errand was his and not hers. He closed the door gently behind him. The feed store smelled the way feed stores always smelled, of molasses grain and leather tack and the warm dry dust of sacked alfalfa pellets and the clean metallic edge of new nails in open bins. A propane heater under the front counter hissed softly. A radio behind the register played a country station at a volume that was almost but not quite low enough to ignore. 3 men in wool-lined coats stood near the coffee urn in the back corner, and when the bell above the door rang at Jax's entrance, all 3 of them turned to look at him at exactly the same moment, and none of them smiled. Jax did not meet their eyes. He walked to the counter. The man behind the register was 68 years old, wore a pair of bifocals on a beaded chain around his neck, and had a face that had been assembled from the weathered leather of a 40-year career in open-air commerce. A small brass nameplate on his chest pocket read Henderson, R. "Help you," Henderson said. It was not exactly a welcome and not exactly a hostility. It was the standard greeting of a man who had been selling nails and chicken feed to strangers long enough to know that courtesy was cheaper than warmth. "I have a list," Jax said. He laid the paper on the counter. Henderson picked it up. He read it. He read it again. He lifted his bifocals from the beaded chain and set them on his nose and read it a 3rd time. He looked up over the rims of the bifocals. His eyebrows had risen a 1/4 inch. "Burr stones," Henderson said. "Yes, sir," Jax said. "You want 2? 18 inches across. Dressed sharpening pattern. Granite or corundum. And a 100-pound bag of winter wheat berries. For seed." "Not for seed," Jax said. "For test milling." Henderson set the list down. He took off his bifocals. He looked at Jax for a long moment with the clear, patient look of a man trying to decide whether he was being made the subject of an elaborate joke or whether something else was happening. Mr. Henderson said, "What in the hell are you building?" Before Jax could answer, the bell above the door rang again, and Barrett Colson walked into the feed store. Colson was 54 years old. He stood 6'1" and weighed 220 pounds, and he wore it all the way a man wears a body he has not had to work very hard for in the last 20 years. His jacket was a pressed canvas filson that had never been used for actual work, and beneath it a pearl-button Western shirt that had been ironed that morning, and beneath that a small gold watch chain that disappeared into the watch pocket of his denim jeans. His hair was silver at the temples and dark in the center, and it had been cut by a barber who understood that a county commissioner, who was also a real estate developer, needed to look both rugged and trustworthy at the same time. His boots were clean, his hands were clean, his eyes were the color of winter lake ice. "Gentlemen," Coulson said. His voice carried across the feed store with the easy authority of a man who had learned in 1,000 small meetings that a room was simply a stage and that a stage belonged to whoever spoke first. The three men by the coffee urn nodded at him. Henderson nodded at him. Jax did not nod at him. Jax finished writing the total on the bottom of his list and slid it back across the counter. Coulson walked to the counter. He stopped beside Jax, close enough that Jax could smell the faint, careful cologne he wore, an expensive small-batch cologne that had nothing to do with this town and everything to do with the quarterly meetings Coulson drove down to Helena to attend. "You must be Eleanor's new project," Coulson said. He did not look at Jax when he said it. He looked at Henderson. He was smiling. Jax said nothing. "I heard she picked you up at the Miller Creek rest stop," Coulson said. "Is that right, mister? I hope you understand that a woman her age is not always in her right mind. She was at one of my meetings 2 winters ago, and she could not remember what year it was. I say that with concern. I say that out of long-standing respect for her late husband." Jax looked at the wall behind Henderson's head. There was a calendar with a picture of a bull elk on it. The calendar was 2 years out of date. "I'm asking you," Coulson said, and his voice had not changed volume, and had not changed tone, and had not changed its smile, "whether you are currently taking advantage of an 81-year-old widow." The feed store went very still. The three men by the coffee urn had stopped pretending not to listen. Henderson had set down his pen. Jax turned his head, slowly, and looked directly at Barrett Coulson for the first time. Coulson's winter ice eyes met his and held them. Jax's gaze did not have heat in it. Jax's gaze had the quiet, specific weight of a man who had once had a 14-year-old boy point a Kalashnikov at him at a checkpoint outside Kandahar and had not fired. Jax's gaze was the gaze of a man whom civilian anger could not reach, because civilian anger did not know the grammar of his attention. "Sir," Jax said, and his voice was calm and flat and unhurried, "I am here to buy feed. If you have a question about Mrs. Hayes, I would suggest you take it to Mrs. Hayes." Coulson's smile did not change. Coulson's smile was not the kind of smile that changed. "I see," Coulson said. "I appreciate your discretion. I imagine a man in your position has a lot of practice with it." He turned to Henderson. "Roy, add his total to my tab. As a courtesy." "Thank you, Commissioner," Jax said. His voice had not changed. "I will be paying with cash." He counted the bills out of the folded envelope he had pulled from his inside breast pocket. $286. He laid them on the counter in a neat stack. He did not look at Coulson again. Henderson took the cash with a small flat nod and wrote a receipt in careful blue ballpoint. Coulson watched the whole transaction with the patient, attentive smile of a man storing information for later use. "Well," Coulson said at last, as Henderson handed Jax the receipt, "I will tell you what, friend. A man like you passes through a town like this once in a while. Sometimes he stays a week. Sometimes he stays a month. But he never stays a year. You understand what I mean?" "Yes, sir," Jax said. "I understand exactly what you mean." He picked up his receipt. He folded it once and put it in his breast pocket. He walked past Barrett Coulson without touching his shoulder, and he walked past the three men at the coffee urn without looking at them, and he walked out the front door of Henderson's Feed and Hardware without letting the bell ring any louder than it needed to. Behind him he heard Coulson say something low, and then he heard one of the three men by the coffee urn laugh. The laugh was short and ugly, and it had the same shape as the laugh in the diner that he had not yet walked into. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the gray afternoon light, and he breathed in slowly, and he breathed out slowly. Smoky, watching him through the passenger window of the Silverado, was already standing up on the bench seat. Her amber eyes were level with his. She had read the whole interaction through the window glass. She did not need him to explain. The diner was 3 doors down from the feed store. He had planned to stop there for coffee. He was considering not stopping there now. The Silverado's tank was only half full, and Eleanor had asked him to refuel before he came home. He could do the refueling at the gas station on the other end of Main Street and skip the diner. He stood on the sidewalk for another long moment, weighing it, and in the weighing his hand found itself resting flat against his left breast pocket where the folded divorce decree had traveled for 14 months. The weight of it, small and still, steadied him. He did not run. He had never run. He had walked into worse rooms than this diner for 712 consecutive days in a country that was not his own. He crossed the street. The Elkhorn Creek Diner had 12 booths and a long formica counter, and a pie case that rotated under a single dim bulb. The air inside smelled of bacon grease and burned coffee, and the wet wool of 3 dozen heavy coats hung on pegs by the door. The tables were half full. Every head in the place turned when he walked in, and every head in the place turned back away again a moment later, and that was when he saw her. She was sitting alone at the counter at the far end. A mug of coffee in front of her, a small spiral notebook open beside the mug, a pen in her right hand. She was maybe 30 years old. Her hair was a tired honey blonde, pulled back in a plain elastic. She wore a gray hooded sweatshirt under a thin navy blue work coat. On the coat over the left breast was a small embroidered patch in the shape of a folded American flag, the kind of patch that was only given to the spouses of men and women who had died in service. Her name, he would learn a moment later, was Ruth Callahan. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Eli Callahan, had been killed outside Kandahar 11 years earlier, leaving her with a 3-year-old boy who was now 14 and a small rented 2-bedroom on the east edge of town. She worked 3 shifts a week at the hospital laundry in Helena and drove the 90 miles there and back on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. She was the only person in Elkhorn Creek who looked up from her coffee when Jax walked in and did not immediately look away. She met his eyes. She nodded once, with the specific small nod of one person recognizing another person from across a language they both knew. He returned the nod. He took the empty stool 2 seats down from hers. He ordered black coffee. The waitress poured it without speaking. Ruth Callahan turned back to her notebook. He did not speak to her. He did not need to. Something had been acknowledged. That was enough. That was how soldiers recognized soldiers, and that was how the families of soldiers recognized the families of soldiers, and he drank his coffee slowly, and he did not turn around when the laughter started at the booth behind him, the laughter of men who had seen Barrett Colson leave the feed store and who had connected the dots, and when the word veteran floated across the room from one of those men in the specific tone that Barrett Colson had used earlier that afternoon, Jax did not flinch. He finished his coffee. He left a $2 tip. He tipped his head at Ruth Callahan on his way out, and she tipped hers in return. He walked out of the diner, and he climbed into the blue Silverado beside Smoky, and the machinery of a town's indifference turned one slow notch behind him and kept turning. The snow came down again, the first week of December, a slow, heavy, steady fall that began at dusk on a Tuesday and did not stop for 41 hours. Jax worked through it. He worked in the barn by the light of a single clip-on work lamp clamped to the rafter above the blue 1968 Ford, rebuilding the central gearbox head of the air motor from the inside out, removing the seized bearings one by one with a hand-cranked bearing puller that Eleanor had pulled from a wooden crate in the root cellar, cleaning 40-year-old grease out of gear teeth with a stiff brass brush, measuring tolerances with a pair of vernier calipers that had been Daniel's and had his initials scratched into the handle in small, uneven letters. Smoky slept on a folded horse blanket 3 feet from his boots. She slept the way working dogs sleep, one ear up at all times, the long, muscular flank rising and falling in slow, patient breaths. The amber eyes slitted half open whenever the barn door creaked in the wind or a branch cracked under the weight of new snow outside. The work was the kind of work he had needed for 14 months without knowing he needed it. His hands remembered things he had forgotten he knew. The way a properly torqued bolt sits in its seat. The way a bearing race sounds when it is seated correctly, a small, high, clean metallic note. The way grease smells when it has been sitting in the same gear teeth since 1985. Each small task was a small, clean thing that he could finish and set down, and each small finished thing was another small piece of rubble cleared from the space inside him where rubble had been stacked for a long time. Eleanor brought him coffee in the morning, and stew at noon, and bread and butter in the evening, and she did not talk while he ate. She sat at the small pine table in the tack room with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched Smoky, and sometimes Smoky watched her, and the two of them had conversations in silence that Jax did not try to interrupt. At night he slept in the small north bedroom on the second floor of the farmhouse. The bed was a single iron frame painted white. The mattress was firm. The quilt had been stitched by Eleanor's mother in 1956 and had been washed so many times that its reds had all gone the color of dried roses. He slept in 3-hour stretches. Smoky slept at the foot of the bed on a folded wool blanket that Eleanor had laid there on the first night without being asked. The house made the old sounds that old houses make, settling against the cold, and he learned the sounds one by one until they were no longer strangers. On the 9th day, he began installing the blades. The blades had come in a crate on a freight truck from a Windmill restoration outfit in South Dakota that had cost him more than he had planned to spend but less than he had feared. 18 galvanized steel air motor blades, each one curved in the specific compound curve that Daniel's original 1958 design had specified, each one drilled to the exact bolt pattern of the hub flange. He climbed the lattice tower with a canvas tool bag slung across his back and a coil of safety line clipped to his belt. 38 feet. The cold at the top was a different cold. The wind up there did not simply touch a man, it moved through him, and the view from that height opened the whole valley beneath his boots like a map drawn in charcoal and white. He worked with gloves off, his bare scarred hands threading bolts through the hub flange one by one. Smoky sat at the base of the tower and watched him climb and watched him work and did not move until he came back down. On the 15th day, the wind caught the new blades and the hub turned for the first time in 38 years, slow and even and smooth, and the gearbox beneath it translated the turning into a low, patient hum. And Jax stood at the base of the tower in the pale, early morning light and watched the blades turn, and he did not say anything for a long time. Eleanor came down from the house in her heavy straw-colored coat and stood beside him, and her face was very still, and after a while she reached up and put her gloved hand flat on the lattice steel of the tower, the way a person places a hand on a coffin at a funeral, and she left it there for maybe 10 seconds, and then she took it away. "Thank you," she said. "Not yet," Jax said. "The gear train still needs testing. The millstones are not dressed. The bearings on the output shaft are not seated. We are weeks out." "I know," Eleanor said. "I was not thanking you for the mill." He did not ask her what she was thanking him for. He thought he knew. He was not certain he could bear to be right. The trigger came 4 nights later, at 3:47 in the morning, in a wind that had turned from the northwest and had come down off the ridgeline with a strange, uneven rolling quality that had not been in it before. The new blades caught that wind, and the old gearbox translated that wind, and the whole tower began to make a sound that it had not made in the previous 3 weeks of testing. The sound was a slow, rhythmic, heavy pulse, thwoop, 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 a deep, percussive beat that the cold air carried through the open windows of the farmhouse and up through the floorboards of the small north bedroom, where Jax was sleeping under the old rose-colored quilt. His eyes opened in the dark. His body was already upright before his mind had processed the sound. His right hand was already reaching for the rifle that was not there, had not been there in 14 months, had been signed over to the armorer at Fort Lewis on the last day of his enlistment, and the absence of its weight in his palm was the first thing that told him where and when he was. The second thing was Smoky. She was already on her feet at the foot of the bed, her amber eyes fixed on his face, her body oriented toward him with the alert, calm precision of an animal who had read the shift in his breathing 2 seconds before he had. Thwup, thwup, thwup. The rotor wash of a black hawk at low altitude sounded exactly like that. Exactly. The ear did not forget. The body did not forget. His lungs pulled in air that tasted of cold pine and old quilt batting, but underneath that his brain was tasting burning diesel and powdered concrete, and the specific iron bloom of a wound that had been his best friend's and not his, and he was not in the small north bedroom anymore. He was in a dust-choked courtyard in Helmand Province, and the sound above him was the extraction bird, and the body at his feet was a body he had carried for a quarter mile, and a quarter mile was not enough, because the sound above him had been the extraction bird that did not land. The extraction bird that had been waved off, the extraction bird that had kept going, and the body at his feet had still been alive when they had started running, and had not been alive when they had stopped. Thwup, thwup, thwup. His hands were shaking, his breathing was in his throat and not in his lungs. The cold sweat had come up across his back in a single sheet. He swung his legs over the edge of the iron bed, and he pressed his bare feet hard into the cold wooden floorboards, and he tried to do the 4 count, 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold, the way the counselor at the VA in Tacoma had taught him to do it, and the count was not working. The count was not working because the sound above him was still the sound above him, and the part of him that had been trained at Fort Benning and the part of him that had been trained in Helmand Province were arguing with each other in 2 different languages. And under the argument, the old dark voice that came at 3:47 in the morning was starting to speak very quietly. The voice that said you should not still be here. The voice that said you do not owe anyone another morning. And he had heard that voice before. And he had heard that voice before, and each time he had heard it, he had needed something specific and very small to take him back out of the room he was in, and into the room he was actually in. Smoky moved. She did not bark. She did not whine. She walked with the slow, even controlled steps of a dog who understood exactly how much weight her body could carry across a room of ice, and she laid the full warm mass of her chest directly across his bare feet, and she pressed her heavy amber-eyed head into his lap, and she leaned into him with the patient, deliberate weight of a soldier pulling another soldier back across a line. And the heat of her coat through his thin cotton pajama pants was the first specific physical sensation that his body had registered in 90 seconds, and the specific warm living weight of her on his feet was the second, and the slow steady sound of her breathing against his stomach was the third. And on the third his lungs opened again and pulled in a full breath, and on the 4th breath the sound above him became the sound of a windmill, and on the 5th breath the dust-choked courtyard in Helmand Province was no longer in the small north bedroom with him. Thwup, thwup, thwup. Windmill, windmill, windmill. He bent forward over her back, and he buried his face in the thick, warm double coat along her shoulders, and he stayed there for a long time, and she did not move, and she did not move, and she did not move, and when at last he lifted his face from her coat, the shaking in his hands had slowed to a low tremor, and the old dark voice had gone back to wherever it went between visits, and he was alive, and he was in the small north bedroom of Eleanor Hayes's farmhouse, and the windmill he had built with his own hands was turning in the wind outside the window, and the sound of it was not the sound he had heard a moment ago, and would never be that sound again. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. He pulled on his trousers and his boots, and his heavy canvas field jacket, and he took his green rucksack out from the closet, and he laid the rucksack on the bed, and he began to pack. His hands folded the 2 thermal undershirts, and the 2 pairs of wool socks, and the wool sweater, and the extra field pants, and placed them in the bottom of the rucksack in the careful square-cornered way that hands had been trained to do a long time ago. He took the shaving kit from the dresser. He took the small leather photograph folder from the top drawer. He took the folded divorce decree from the inside breast pocket of the jacket and looked at it for a moment and slid it back into the pocket. Smoky sat at the foot of the bed and watched him pack and did not look away, and the amber eyes did not have judgment in them, only a patient, unreadable steadiness, the steadiness of a soldier who had followed him across 3 foreign countries and 2 American ones, and would follow him across a 4th and a 3rd, but whose steadiness carried inside it the small, quiet weight of a question he could not answer. He carried the rucksack downstairs at a little before 6 in the morning. The kitchen was dark. The wood stove had burned down to embers. He set the rucksack beside the back door. He pulled on his gloves. He reached for the doorknob. Eleanor Hayes said, "The coffee is almost ready." He turned. She was standing in the open doorway of the pantry in her faded flannel robe and her sheepskin slippers, her silver hair loose on her shoulders, her hands folded in front of her the way she folded them when she sat at the pine table in the tack room and watched him eat. The glass pot of the old percolator was on the stove. The stove had been relit. She had heard him come down the stairs, and she had gotten up, and she had lit the stove, and she had not said anything until now. "Mrs. Hayes," Jax began. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I am not well. Something happened last night. I don't trust myself around you or your house right now. I need to move on. I can finish what I can finish from the road. I'll send you letters. I'll mail you the rest of the drawings if you want." Eleanor Hayes looked at him. She did not try to stop him. She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply looked at him for a long moment with the clear, steady gaze of a woman who had buried a husband and watched him come home from a different war, 40 years earlier, and who had stood in a kitchen, not very different from this one, on a morning not very different from this one, while a different man had told her, in a different way, that he was not well, that he did not trust himself, that he needed to go. "Daniel did the same thing," she said, "twice, the first time in 1969, the second time in 1974. I let him go both times. He came back both times. I buried him here in 1987, and he never went anywhere again. I will tell you what I told him. You are not well. You are also not a danger to me. A man who was a danger to me would not have stood in my barn for 15 days and rebuilt my husband's windmill for $100 a week. A man who is a danger to me would not have a dog who looks at me the way that dog looks at me. I am 81 years old. I do not have to guess about men anymore. I know what I am looking at. If you leave this morning, the coffee will be cold, and I will be disappointed, and my husband's last drawings will sit in a barn for the next 38 years, the way they sat in a barn for the last 38 years. If you stay, the coffee will be hot, and I will be grateful, and we will both go back to work. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I am only going to tell you what is true." She turned and walked to the stove and poured 2 mugs of coffee. She set them on the pine table. She sat down in her chair. She did not look at the door. Jax stood with his gloved hand on the doorknob for a very long time. Smoky sat beside the rucksack at his feet and waited with her. He set the rucksack down. He took off his gloves. He walked to the table and sat down across from Eleanor Hayes. She slid the mug toward him. He took it in both hands. The warmth of it passed through the ceramic into his scarred palms. Smoky moved to lie across his boots under the table, and the warmth of her pressed into his feet the way it had pressed into them in the dark 4 hours ago, and he closed his eyes for a moment and he breathed out, slow, long, and he opened his eyes, and Eleanor Hayes was watching him with the same steady, patient gaze, and she did not say anything, and she was not going to say anything, and he understood that she had said everything that needed saying already. He drank the coffee. It was very hot. It was very good. After a while he said, "I'm sorry I scared you." "You didn't scare me," Eleanor said. "I scared myself," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "That is a different thing." The first storm arrived on January 9th. It was not the storm that would take the valley down. It was the storm that prepared the valley for the storm that would. It came in from the northwest at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday. A thick, heavy curtain of wet snow that rode on a 40-mile-an-hour wind, and it dropped 22 inches on Elkhorn Valley in the space of 11 hours. The power flickered twice and stayed on. The valley exhaled. The second storm arrived on January 16th. It was a different animal. It began as freezing rain at 4 in the afternoon, and it coated every power line in the county with a half-inch of glassy ice before midnight. Then the wind came. By 2 in the morning, the transmission corridor 42 miles to the south had 6 downed towers. By 3 in the morning, the substation on the east edge of town had gone dark. By 3:15, every house in the valley was running on whatever small backup it had, or on nothing at all, and the temperature at the weather station on the airport runway had dropped to 11 degrees below zero. Jax woke at 3:22 in the morning to the specific silence of a house that had lost its refrigerator hum. He knew the sound of the loss the way a man who has lived through 2 deployments knows the sound of silence that is about to become noise. He lit the kerosene lamp on the nightstand. He pulled on his boots. He went downstairs. Eleanor was already in the kitchen, already dressed, already stoking the wood stove back to full heat. She had lived in this house for 57 winters. She did not need a weather report to tell her what was happening. She did not look up when he came into the kitchen. The pipes will freeze by 6. There are 3 more cords of split wood under the east eave. The generator in the root cellar has not been started since 2019. I don't know if it will turn. The barn has 200 pounds of wheat berries. The cow will need the heat lamp off the generator or she won't make it to the weekend. I'll start with the generator, Jax said. I'll start with the bread, Eleanor said. The generator turned. The cow lived. The bread rose. By the time the gray smear of dawn had come up over the eastern ridge, the Hayes farmstead was running on a sealed wood stove, a propane cook stove, a single 5-gallon kerosene lamp, a 15-kilowatt diesel generator that was running only during daylight hours to preserve fuel, and a hand-cranked grist mill that Jax had finished installing 9 days earlier, and that turned, when he engaged the gearbox clutch on the tower, with a slow, patient, low RPM grinding that could produce 4 pounds of coarse whole wheat flour per hour if the wind was cooperative and 6 pounds per hour if it was not. The wind on the morning of January 17th was cooperative. The news came to them in pieces over the next 7 days. The transmission line repair was going to take weeks, not days. The substation had suffered damage beyond what the utility had on hand. A replacement transformer was being shipped from a facility in Ohio and would not arrive until the first week of February. The Rural Electric Cooperative had released a statement using the phrase extended outage. The governor had released a statement using the phrase winter emergency. By January 24th, the valley had been without power for 8 days. By February 1st, the valley had been without power for 16 days. By February 9th, the estimate for grid restoration had slipped to mid-March at earliest, and a second winter storm had come through and knocked down the patch repairs that had been made on the southern spur, and the town of Elkhorn Creek had opened the Baptist church basement and the American Legion Hall as warming centers, and the grocery store had sold through its bread shelves on day 9 and had not received a resupply since because the state highway to Helena had been closed by drifts 3 times and the store's small generator could only keep the freezers and coolers running. People began to arrive at the Hayes farmstead on day 11. They came in small pickups with chains on the tires, they came on snowmobiles, they came on foot walking the last half-mile of the unplowed drive in insulated boots, carrying empty flour sacks and canvas bags and plastic buckets. Word had moved through Elkhorn Creek the way word moved through towns in winters. One phone call on a neighbor's satellite phone, one conversation at the warming center, one handed-over loaf of Eleanor Hayes's whole wheat bread broken in half over a potbelly stove by a woman who had walked from the farmstead that morning with 4 loaves wrapped in a tea towel in her coat. The crazy man with the old windmill had flour. The crazy man with the old windmill had bread. The crazy man with the old windmill, as it turned out, was not crazy. Jax set up a system. Eleanor set up a system. Ruth Callahan, who arrived on day 12 with her 14-year-old son, Ethan, and a casserole dish wrapped in a frozen dish towel, set up a system. The system worked like this. Families coming to the farmstead brought their own wheat if they had it. If they had it, Jax milled their grain into flour for a flat fee of nothing in exchange for 4 hours of their labor on the property, split wood or shovel the path or help Eleanor bake loaves for families who had no wheat of their own to bring. If they did not have their own wheat, Jax milled from Eleanor's stores at the same exchange, plus a single handshake agreement that the family would return the equivalent weight in grain when the valley came back online. No one refused. No one was refused. Smoky watched every arrival from the porch steps with the calm, observational precision of a checkpoint guard, and Smoky had never once in 14 days so much as shown her teeth at any of the hundreds of people who had come and gone across the Hayes property, because Smoky read the faces of people who had walked 2 miles in 11 below temperatures for bread, and Smoky understood what she was looking at. The night of February 18th was the worst night of the storm, and the worst night of the outage, and the worst night, though Jax did not yet know this, of everything that was about to happen. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero at 6 in the evening. The wind came back up out of the northwest at 35 miles an hour. A third storm front had arrived late in the afternoon and had dropped another 14 inches of fine powder snow over the valley in 5 hours. The American Legion Warming Center had lost its secondary generator at 4 in the afternoon. The Baptist church basement had become too full by 6. By 7:30 in the evening, 22 people had made their way to the Hayes farmstead on foot or on snowmobile, because the word had gone around town that the old Hayes place had a wood stove running at full heat and a kitchen 22 feet long and a hostess who would turn no one away. The kitchen was full. The kitchen was full the way a lifeboat is full. Every chair was occupied. Every inch of floor space against the walls was occupied. Children sat cross-legged on wool blankets laid across the hardwood. Men stood along the east wall with their backs against the wainscoting and their coats steaming in the warmth. Women worked in shifts at the long pine table, kneading bread dough that Eleanor had set to rise in 6 ceramic crocks at 2 in the afternoon. The air inside the kitchen was thick with the good smells of baking bread and wood smoke and wet wool and coffee boiled on the cook stove, and underneath those good smells was the thinner, sharper smell of too many frightened people pressed too close together for too many hours. Ruth Callahan's son, Ethan, sat at the far end of the kitchen in a child-sized wooden chair that had belonged to Eleanor's son 50 years earlier, and next to him on a folded blanket sat a 3-year-old boy in a blue snowsuit, whose mother, a young woman named Tanya Brewer, had walked him 3 miles through the fresh powder that afternoon because her kerosene heater had run out of fuel at noon, and the warming center had turned her away at 4. The boy's name was Caleb. He was crying, quietly, into the palms of his small red mittens. He had been crying quietly for 20 minutes. His mother Tanya was kneading bread at the long pine table with her back to him because she did not have anywhere else to put her hands and because she had learned on the walkover that if she looked at her son, she would also begin to cry, and that would help neither of them. Smoky was lying beside Jax's boots at the kitchen doorway, where she had stationed herself at 6 that evening and where she had remained for 2.5 hours. She had not moved. She had not turned her head. Her amber eyes had tracked every new arrival and every coat that came off and every pair of boots that went to the mat by the door, and she had catalogued every single voice in the kitchen, and she had not moved. At 8:47 in the evening, Barrett Colson arrived. He did not knock. He came through the front door without knocking, in a brand-new insulated parka and a pair of leather snow gloves and a shearling hat, and behind him came 2 men Jax had seen at the coffee urn at the feed store on the first day. Colson's face was flushed from the cold and from something else. He walked into the kitchen without taking off his boots. The snow on his boots dripped onto the hardwood. Eleanor looked up from the pine table. She did not speak. "Mrs. Hayes," Colson said, his voice was pitched for the whole room, "I'm sorry to come in on you like this. I have been at the County Emergency Operations Center in Helena for 48 hours. We have a situation. The state has declared a Level 3 emergency for this valley. That means the county commissioners now have the authority to coordinate resource distribution across private holdings. We have been made aware of the operation you have running on this property. We appreciate what you have been doing. We are here to help you run it properly." Eleanor Hayes set down the wooden spoon she had been holding. She set it down very carefully, the way a person sets down a small fragile object that she does not want to drop. "Mr. Colson," Eleanor said, "my operation is running properly. My operation has fed 304 people in 14 days. My operation does not require your help. Please take your boots off, or please leave." The 2 men behind Colson shifted their weight. Colson's smile, which had been in place since he had walked through the door, did not change, and he did not take off his boots. "Mrs. Hayes," Colson said, "with respect, you are 81 years old. You are running a flour distribution operation out of a wood stove kitchen in a house that has not been inspected for a commercial food operation. You have a transient veteran of uncertain mental condition operating a piece of modified agricultural machinery that also has not been inspected. You have 24 people in this kitchen in what I am obligated to tell you is a fire code violation of a serious order. The county is prepared to help you. The county is prepared to take the grain currently on this property into a central distribution at the Legion Hall, where the distribution can be done safely and equitably. I am sure you want what is best for this valley. I am sure you do not want anyone to be hurt because of a well-intentioned but disorganized private effort." The kitchen had gone silent. No one was kneading. No one was pouring. Every face in the kitchen was turned toward Colson, or toward Eleanor, or toward Jax. who was standing in the doorway to the kitchen with his right hand loose at his side and his left hand resting flat on the frame of the door. Smoky, at his feet, had not moved. Her amber eyes were fixed on Barrett Colson's boots. The 3-year-old boy in the blue snowsuit had stopped crying into his mittens because the room had gone quiet, and now he was looking around the kitchen with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of a child who understood that something had gone wrong without understanding what. He began to cry again, louder this time. His small hands pressed over his ears, his shoulders drew up toward his neck. He curled forward in the small chair. His mother Tanya turned from the pine table. Her face was streaked with flour. Her eyes were full. She took one step toward him, and then she stopped, because Barrett Colson was still speaking, and because she did not want to cross the room in front of him, and because she did not know what to do with her flour-covered hands. Smoky stood up. She did not bark, she did not whine, she did not look at Jax, she did not look at Barrett Colson. She walked, with the slow, measured, controlled gait of a working dog who had decided on a course of action and was executing it, directly across the length of the kitchen. She walked past Eleanor. She walked past Tanya. She walked past the long pine table, and past the 6 ceramic crocks of rising bread dough, and past the pot-belly stove, and past the 2 men who had come in with Colson, and not one of them moved, because not one of them knew what she was doing, because she was moving with a purpose none of them could read. She reached the small wooden chair at the far end of the kitchen. She lowered herself into a slow, careful sit beside the 3-year-old boy in the blue snowsuit. She laid herself down. She placed the full, heavy, warm length of her thick, double-coated body across the boy's small red boots. And she turned her heavy, noble head, and she laid her muzzle into his lap, and she looked up at him with her amber eyes, and she did not move. The boy stopped crying. He stopped crying the way a wire stops humming when the current is cut. All at once, his small hands lowered from his ears. His small hands, one after the other, came to rest on the top of Smoky's broad, warm head, and his small fingers, which had been clenched inside the red mittens a moment before, spread wide across the thick fur. And he sat there in the small wooden chair that had belonged to Eleanor's son 50 years earlier. And he held on to the dog the way a drowning child holds onto a piece of floating wood, and Smoky did not move, and Smoky did not move, and Smoky did not move. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Nobody moved for a very long time. Eleanor Hayes stood at the pine table with one flour-covered hand resting on the spoon she had set down. Tanya Brewer stood 2 steps from her son with her own flour-covered hands lifted halfway to her mouth. Ruth Callahan stood by the stove with a kettle in her hand. The 2 men behind Barrett Colson looked at each other and then looked at the floor. The 14 other adults and 6 other children in the kitchen simply stood or sat where they were, and they watched the 3-year-old boy and the dog, and nobody said anything, and Jax in the doorway felt the thing that had been closed inside his chest for 14 months begin very quietly to open. Barrett Colson had stopped talking. He had stopped talking in the middle of his sentence, and now he was looking at the far end of the kitchen with the blank, uncomprehending expression of a man who had prepared a speech for a room and was now discovering that the room was not the room he had thought it was. His 2 men behind him were not looking at him. His 2 men behind him were looking at the boy and the dog. His 2 men behind him were, one of them, the one on the left, very quietly, without moving his hands from his sides, beginning to cry. Eleanor Hayes spoke. Her voice was very quiet. Her voice carried the whole length of the kitchen. "Mr. Colson," she said, "you will leave my house now. You will leave quietly. You will take your boots with you. We will talk about the county's concerns when the county is done pretending it has them." Colson looked at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the far end of the kitchen one more time, and whatever he had been about to say he did not say. He turned. His 2 men turned with him, except the one who had been crying did not turn immediately, and when he did turn, he turned with his face lowered and his gloves in his hands. They walked out of the kitchen. They walked out of the house. The door closed behind them with a soft click that the frame had not made in several hours. The kitchen exhaled. It exhaled as a single room. The sound of it was a small collective breath that had been held for 90 seconds and was now released, and it rose up into the rafters and settled back down across the long pine table and the wood stove and the 6 ceramic crocks and the hardwood floor. And Ruth Callahan set down her kettle, and Tanya Brewer crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and dropped to her knees beside her son and the dog, and she wrapped her arms around both of them at once, and she pressed her flour-covered face into the thick, warm fur of Smoky's shoulder, and she wept. She wept the way a person weeps who has been holding herself upright for 48 hours by the thin wire of her own will, and the wire has finally been cut, and her body has remembered how to bend. Smoky did not move. The boy did not move. He kept both of his small hands buried in the dog's thick coat. He looked up at his mother with the calm, unsurprised eyes of a child who understood something he would never have the words for. And he said, very quietly, "Mama, the dog is warm." "I know, baby," Tanya said. "I know." Jax stood in the doorway. His left hand was still resting on the frame. His right hand was open and still at his side. He was not looking at Smoky. He was looking at the boy. He was looking at the small curled shoulders and the small red mittens that had fallen to the floor beside the wooden chair and the small hands that were buried in the dog's fur. And he was remembering, without meaning to remember, a photograph that Melanie had taken of a different child on a different porch a long time ago. A child who had called him Dad in a voice that had not yet learned to be careful, and he was realizing, very slowly, the way a man realizes a thing he has been refusing to realize for 14 months, that what he had been carrying in his inside breast pocket all that time was not a decree, was not a piece of paper, was not even a marriage. What he had been carrying was a small red mitten. He had been carrying the small red mitten of a child who needed a warm dog and a warm hand and a warm voice in a kitchen that did not belong to either of them, and he had been carrying it because he had not yet forgiven himself for not being there to hold it, and he was carrying it still, and maybe, possibly, in a kitchen on a Montana farmstead in the coldest February in 14 years, he could set it down. He did not know yet if he could set it down. He knew only that something in his chest had opened, and that it did not close, and that the room was warm, and that Smoky had walked across the kitchen, and that his hands were not shaking. Ruth Callahan crossed the kitchen and stood beside him in the doorway. She did not touch him. She stood about 18 inches to his right, and she looked out across the kitchen with him, and after a while she said, very quietly, so that only he could hear, "My husband had a dog like that, in Kandahar. He wrote about her in every letter. He said she knew things nobody else knew." "They do," Jax said. His voice was rough. "They do know things." "I'm glad you came here," Ruth Callahan said. Jax did not answer. He could not have spoken even if he had known what to say. He simply nodded once, very small, the way Eleanor Hayes nodded when she was containing a large feeling inside a small gesture, and Ruth Callahan nodded back at him in the same way, and together they stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and together they watched the 3-year-old boy and the retired military working dog, and together they watched Tanya Brewer cry against the shoulder of the dog, and together they watched the kitchen come back to life around the small frozen moment at its center, and the bread went back into the oven, and the kettle went back onto the stove, and the long night of February 18th moved past its worst hour, and outside the farmhouse the windmill turned in the wind. And inside the farmhouse, the dam that had been holding back 14 months of grief in one specific scarred-handed man had not quite broken, but it had cracked. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The thaw began on the 9th of March. It did not come all at once, the way thaws come in the movies. It came the way thaws come in real Montana valleys, in patient increments. A 5-degree afternoon followed by a 2-degree night, a single patch of bare brown pasture showing through on the south slope of the foothill behind the house, a single creek under the bridge on the county road beginning to run clear where it had run black ice for 11 weeks. The grid came back on the 14th of March at 6:47 in the evening, and the refrigerator in Eleanor's kitchen hummed itself back to life with a small, startled clunking sound, And Eleanor stood at the counter and looked at the refrigerator for a long moment, the way a person looks at a friend who has returned from a long trip abroad, and then she turned back to the dough she was kneading, and she did not interrupt the rhythm of her hands. The mill kept turning. The people kept coming. The grid coming back on did not, as it turned out, stop the valley from wanting bread from the Hayes farmstead, because the valley had learned in 91 days without power what bread made from your neighbor's wheat, by your neighbor's hands, in your neighbor's kitchen, actually tasted like, and the valley had decided, collectively and without discussion, that it did not want to stop tasting it. Jax milled flour on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Eleanor baked on Wednesdays and Fridays. Ruth Callahan drove down from her small rented house on the east edge of town on Saturdays and helped Eleanor bake an extra 20 loaves for the families in the valley who had come to rely on them, and for the small weekly collection that Ruth and Eleanor had started delivering to the nursing home in Helena on Ruth's commute. The operation was no longer a crisis response. The operation was a small standing thing. It had become, in the quiet language of things that become what they are without being named, a bakery. Jax's PTSD did not go away. Jax's PTSD would not go away. Jax understood this now in a way he had not understood it in the 14 months before the night of the rotor wash, because he had begun to see a counselor at the VA satellite office in Helena once every 2 weeks. Eleanor had made the appointment for him the morning after the storm without asking. She had driven him the first time. She had sat in the waiting room with her hands folded and Smoky on a leather leash at her feet, and she had read a paperback novel that had belonged to Daniel. And when Jax had come out of the session, 45 minutes later, she had not asked him how it went. She had simply stood up and put the novel in her coat pocket and walked him to the truck. He had gone to the third appointment alone. He had not yet gone to the fourth. He would. He knew he would. Smoky would make sure of it. Eleanor would make sure of it. Ruth Callahan would make sure of it. The twist came on a Wednesday in the third week of March. It came in the form of a silver Toyota Highlander with Colorado plates that pulled up the long driveway between the 2 rows of cottonwoods at 10:15 in the morning, driven by a 54-year-old man in a pressed gray field coat who looked exactly like his mother if his mother had spent the last 40 years working at a desk in a city. The man parked the Highlander in front of the farmhouse. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, his hands resting on the top of the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the farmhouse porch. Then he got out. Smoky saw him first. She was on the porch. She did not bark. She stood up slowly from the blanket where she had been sleeping in the pale spring sunlight, and she walked to the edge of the porch steps, and she watched the man cross the gravel drive, and her amber eyes were steady and unblinking, and her posture was the specific still posture that she held when she was reading the posture of someone else. The man stopped at the base of the porch steps. He looked up at Smoky. He looked past Smoky, through the screen door, into the interior of the house. He took a slow breath. "Ma," he said. His voice was not loud. It carried. "It's me. It's David." Eleanor came out of the kitchen and through the front hallway to the screen door. She pushed it open with one flour-covered hand. She looked down at her son for the space of 2 long seconds. Then she stepped aside to let him in. David Hayes stood in the living room of the farmhouse he had left in 1989 at the age of 17 and had returned to only 11 times in the 37 years since, the last of those 11 visits having been in the summer of 2021. He stood with his coat still on. He looked at the old rose-colored quilt folded across the back of the horsehair sofa. He looked at the black and white framed photograph of his father in his marine dress blues that hung above the fireplace. He looked at Smoky, who had followed him into the living room and had sat herself down in the precise geometric middle of the braided rug, facing him, her amber eyes level on his. "Ma," he said, "I heard from Barrett Colson last week. He told me what has been happening here. He said you had a homeless man living in the house. He said you had been feeding the valley for 3 months out of a grist mill that somebody rigged up in the back pasture. He said he tried to help you put the operation under county supervision, and you sent him away. He said he was concerned about your mental state. He said I should come." Eleanor did not speak. "I'm not saying I believe everything he said, Ma. I am saying I came because he said it. I am saying I came because you are 81 and you live out here alone, and I have not been a good son to you, and I know I have not been a good son to you, and if something is happening to you, I want to know about it before I hear about it from a county commissioner who has been trying to buy this place from you for 6 years." He took off his coat. He laid it across the back of the horsehair sofa. He sat down in the leather wing chair that had been his father's. He put his hands on his knees. He looked up at his mother. "I also came," he said, more quietly, because he said a man named Jax Harlan has been living here, and I wanted to meet him. Eleanor sat down in the rocking chair across from him. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Smoky for a moment. Smoky looked back at her. Eleanor turned to her son. "Jax is in the barn," Eleanor said. "He has been in the barn since 5:30 this morning. He is dressing a set of burr stones because the valley has been using them hard for 10 weeks, and they need redressing. He will come in at noon for lunch. I will introduce you to him then. In the meantime, David, I would like you to do something for me. I would like you to come into the barn office with me. There is something I want to show you. I have been waiting 38 years to show it to you." David Hayes looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he stood up. The barn office was the small partitioned room at the south end of the barn, where Daniel had kept his drafting table and his library and his filing cabinets and his welding catalogs. Eleanor had not changed the room since 1987. The drafting table still held a half-finished sketch of a bearing housing. The bookshelf held the same 34 engineering manuals and the same collection of Louis L'Amour paperbacks. The filing cabinet in the corner held every receipt and every tax return and every hand-drawn schematic and every piece of correspondence that Daniel Hayes had produced in the last 15 years of his life. Eleanor opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. She lifted out the leather 3-ring binder that Jax had been working from for 3.5 months, the one he had returned to the drawer each night and retrieved each morning. She laid it on the drafting table. She opened it. "Your father worked on this from 1978 to 1987, Eleanor said. "He designed a grain mill powered by the old windmill in the back pasture. He meant to build it. He did not get the chance." David leaned over the binder. He turned the pages slowly. He looked at the precise architectural handwriting, the gear ratios, the bearing specifications, the hand-drawn sketches of the central burr stone. He turned to the last page. The last page was a single sheet of yellowed drafting paper, dated in his father's hand in the upper right corner, March 14th, 1984. The page was not a drawing. The page was a paragraph of text, written out in Daniel Hayes's careful block lettering, 11 lines long. David read it. He read it a second time. He read it a third time, and then he sat down very slowly on the tall wooden stool beside the drafting table, and he did not say anything for a long time. "This design is dedicated to the next one, who comes home with nothing. I have built it with my own hands because I came home with nothing, and a man in this valley took me in and fed me for 18 months until I could feed myself. His name was Henry Barrett Colson, and he is dead now, and his son does not remember what his father did for me. I am writing this so that someday someone will know. This mill will feed this valley when this valley will not feed the next one who comes home with nothing. It is not a business. It is a promise. Pass it on. Semper Fidelis. Daniel Hayes, Staff Sergeant, USMC, 1966 to 1969. David Hayes did not speak for a very long time. He sat on the tall wooden stool with his hands folded in his lap the way his mother folded hers, and he looked at the page on the drafting table, and the muscle along the line of his jaw was working in a slow, small rhythm, and the tears that eventually came did not come in any dramatic way. They came the way tears come to men who have not cried in a long time. They simply arrived, quietly, one at a time, and slid down his face and fell onto the cuff of his shirt and did not attract attention to themselves. "Ma," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Ma, why didn't you ever tell me this?" Because it was not for you, David, Eleanor said gently. It was for him, when the right man came. Your father was very specific. He said I would know. I did not know for 38 years, and then I drove past a rest stop on the way back from Helena on the 2nd of November, and I saw a man sleeping in his truck with a German shepherd. And I drove past, and I turned around 4 miles later, and I drove back, and I saw him again, and I knew. I'm sorry I did not tell you sooner. Your father made me promise. I kept the promise. Jax had been standing in the open doorway of the barn office for the last 45 seconds. He had come in from the main bay of the barn because he had heard voices and had come to see who had arrived. He had stopped in the doorway when he had heard Eleanor say the name Henry Barrett Colson, and he had stood very still and he had listened to the rest of it, and now he stepped back quietly into the shadow of the barn aisle and pressed his shoulder against the old pine plank wall, and he closed his eyes. Henry Barrett Colson. Barrett Colson's father. The man who had taken Daniel Hayes in after Vietnam and had fed him for 18 months until he could feed himself. Jax understood, the way a man understands a thing that has been arranging itself behind him for months without his knowledge, that the son of the man who had saved Daniel Hayes's life had tried, 60 years later, to take Daniel Hayes's farm from Daniel Hayes's widow, and that this was not an irony, was not a tragedy, was not even particularly unusual. It was simply what happened in America when one generation's grace was not taught to the next generation's hands. It was a thing that could be corrected. It was a thing that could be corrected by passing the grace forward instead of sideways, by completing the mill that Henry Barrett Colson had made possible by feeding Daniel Hayes, by feeding the valley now the way Henry Barrett Colson had once fed one man, by letting the circle close at a different door than the one Barrett Colson had tried to close it at. That was the promise. That was the whole promise. That was what Daniel Hayes had written on a piece of yellow drafting paper in March of 1984 and had left for a man he would never meet. Jax opened his eyes. He walked back into the barn office, quietly, and stood in the doorway. Mr. Hayes, he said. David Hayes looked up from the drafting table. His eyes were red. He stood up. Mr. Harlan, he said. They shook hands. It was a long handshake. Neither man broke it early. I owe you an apology, David Hayes said. I do not know you. I came here because a man in a pressed parka called me last week and told me things I'm now understanding were not exactly true. I was prepared to ask you to leave my mother's house today. I am not prepared to do that now. I would like to buy you a cup of coffee. I drink a cup of coffee with you, sir, Jax said. I'm not sure I need an apology. I'm sure I would like to hear about your father. I read his drawings for 3 months before I understood who he was. I would like to understand the man who drew them. I would like to understand him too, David Hayes said. I am 54 years old and I have spent the last 37 years avoiding this house because I did not know how to stand in it. I think maybe I'm going to stand in it for a little while now. If that is all right with my mother. Eleanor Hayes looked at her son across the drafting table. Her face was very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she reached out, and she laid her flour-dusted palm flat on top of the yellowed paragraph of her husband's last writing, and she smiled the small, tired, honest smile that she had smiled at Jax in the rest stop parking lot on the 2nd of November, and she said, David, I would like that very much. There was one more conversation that week. It took place on the following Monday afternoon, on the front porch of the farmhouse, in a pale, warm spring light that had brought the first crocuses up along the foundation of the house, and it took place between Jax Harlan and Barrett Colson. Colson had driven up the long drive in his Ford F-250 alone. He had not knocked. He had stood at the base of the porch steps with his hat in both hands, and he had waited until Jax had come out onto the porch, and he had said, without any of the performance of the feed store 3.5 months earlier, Mr. Harlan, I would like to talk to you, if you have a minute. Jax had sat down on the porch swing. He had gestured to the wooden chair. Colson had sat down. Smoky had laid herself across Jax's boots. Colson had taken a long time to find his first sentence. When he had found it, It had been the simplest sentence a man in his position could have found. "My father never told me about Daniel Hayes," he had said. "I heard about it from my mother yesterday. She had not told me either. Apparently she had promised Eleanor not to. I am 60 years old. I have been trying to buy that mill property for 6 years because I did not know the ground was sacred. I am asking your pardon. I am asking it because I do not know how to ask Daniels. I was the one who laughed at you in the diner. I was the one who walked into that kitchen in February. I was the one who. He could not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Jax had let him sit with it. Jax had let the swing move in the slight afternoon wind. After a while, Jax had said, very quietly, "Mr. Coulson, you don't owe me anything. Your father fed a man who needed to be fed. That is paid for a lot more than your mistakes. What you can do now, if you want to, is help us feed the next one. There will be a next one. There is always a next one. You have a truck. You have a warehouse. You have a voice on the county commission. There are veterans in this valley who are not eating well. There are veterans in this county who are not eating at all. Eleanor has more grain than we can mill alone. We could use a man with a warehouse." Barrett Coulson had looked at Jax for a long moment. Then he had looked at Smoky. Then he had looked at the windmill turning slowly in the pale spring sun above the back pasture. Then he had said, very quietly, "Yes, sir. I believe I could do that." And that was how the Hayes Mill project had started. Not with paperwork. Not with a ribbon. With a man on a porch, and a dog across his boots, and a promise made in 1984 finally, at long last, being kept. The morning of the 1st of May came up gold over the eastern ridge of Elkhorn Valley, and Jax Harlan stood on the front porch of the Hayes farmhouse with a mug of black coffee in his scarred right hand and Smoky leaning warm against his left knee. The air smelled of thawed earth and wet cottonwood bark and the first faint green of the pasture grass beyond the barn. The windmill turned, slow and patient, in the morning wind. On the nail beside the kitchen door, where Daniel Hayes's old canvas work apron had hung for 38 years, now 2 things hung. The canvas apron, soft and oil-stained and smelling of wood smoke, and beside it, on the same nail, Jax Harlan's faded olive-drab field jacket, cuffs frayed soft, 12 years of service folded inside its weight. Jax set his coffee on the porch rail. He reached up. He took down the apron. He tied it on over his thermal shirt and his work pants. The canvas settled across his shoulders the way a thing settles when it has found the back it was meant for. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor was at the stove. Bread was rising on the pine table. At the far end of the drive, a small red pickup was turning in. A woman and a boy, Ruth and Ethan Callahan. It was Saturday. They came on Saturdays. Smoky's tail thumped once, softly, against the porch boards. Jax picked up his coffee. He walked down the porch steps into the gold morning. He had work to do. Some debts a country pays, some it does not, and sometimes one soldier pays them forward to the next. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.